What's up, everybody? Today I wanted to create a quick video on running and various aches and pains in the body, particularly hip and low back pain when running. Um, but this can apply to really any sort of pain that you might have post running or during running, things that tend to flare up in relationship to running. Um, when a person runs, uh, there is a system of movement that needs to happen in order for a person to run effectively. There's a large chain of movements that happens for a person to create a step and then plant on that foot and then follow the back foot through. It's called the gait cycle, and I won't get into that too deeply because that can be a long video. Um, but I wanted to talk about running conditions and how those affect pain and movement when running. Um, so, for example, a client of mine came in dealing with some hip pain, and she has been a long-time runner and was dealing with hip pain that flared up only after she began running on the road, so on concrete. She runs in off-road positions as well, so she does trail runs and places like that where you're running on an uneven surface on the ground. And these two environments are vastly different when running, particularly because in an off-road environment, you're going to be having an unstable surface that changes levels when you move. So when you're running on a trail, for example, the ground is shaped in different ways in different positions. There's rocks, sticks, different things that can be on the ground that your foot and body have to sense and adapt to when you are moving in gait, particularly when running, because there's more force moving through the body when you're running versus simply walking. Versus that environment versus a road environment where the ground is very strong and very stable. There's not much give to it at all, and it's oftentimes very flat. And if there are any changes in the environment, they happen slowly over time. So if you're running up a hill, usually the hill tends to change at a pace over time. There's not very much dramatic differences step to step. Each step you take is pretty predictable of where you're going to be. The most you'll see in bad running conditions are loose roads or roads that are paved uneven, so you have one leg that's going shorter, and a lot of runners will notice that kind of thing. But what struck me is the differences in those two conditions can actually create a much different effect on the body when running. For example, when you're running on an off-road condition or an off-road surface where the environment's very unstable, your body needs to move and adapt. And when it does that, it can shift and change directions, and there's a lot of subtle movements that need to happen in order to adapt to that environment. So for example, if I'm running on a surface that I think is even and I step onto a rock, well, now my left foot is higher than my right foot. My left hip has to pump to compensate for that, and my spine has to compensate for that. And each step is different, so each step is going to have different levels of movement and change. And what will happen with that is up the kinetic chain, so from the feet up, there needs to be compensations for that. So each time you take a step, your knees are going to be in different positions. Your hip is going to be in a different position. Your lumbar spine is going to adapt differently. It's going to move differently and compensate differently, and that's going to work itself all the way up to the neck, the base of the skull, and through the cranial bones. And this is important because in an environment like this, when you are moving in a condition that forces your body to make more decisions and more different ranges of motion, it actually is very good at keeping the body quite mobile and supple. If your body is constantly having to adapt and change to the environment, um, you're going to be getting a lot more pumping effect. Each time you take a step, the energy that happens when you contact the ground shoots up through your foot all the way up to your suboccipitals and into your head, um, and the energy moves up the kinetic chain. When you are walking on an off-road surface like the earth or grass, not only is it a softer surface that absorbs more force, so there's less force coming from your foot, from the reflecting back off your ground up into the foot, the force actually gets absorbed into the ground, versus a concrete environment where if you plant your foot and smack your foot, most of that energy is going to go straight back up into your foot. It doesn't get absorbed into the ground. It goes straight back up into your system. So an off-road system, you're going to have less force being distributed back into your system, but you're also going to have an environment that causes you to have to adapt, which means there's going to be more movement and more pumping. Things are going to move more fluidly. Your body needs to move more fluidly. Versus an off-road situation or an on-road situation where the ground's very hard and the force goes straight back through, your body has to be tense and tight in order to stabilize for all that force. And oftentimes through this tension, especially when coupled with imbalances that are already present in the body before you even run, that force is going to be amplified by the ground, and it's going to go into your body and get trapped in certain places, especially the places that are the most imbalances, usually where you're going to have the symptoms, or the joints that are connected to the muscles that have the most imbalance in them. And that can also be traced back to organ imbalance too. So if your organs are stressed, you can see patterns of organ stress that correlate to different muscles and musculoskeletal systems that can create imbalances. So for example, if your kidneys are stressed out, that can refer and inhibit the muscles of the legs in certain forms, and this imbalance can be amplified by the fact that your legs have to stabilize and your system has to stabilize more to compensate for the impact that's coming from the ground. So why all this matters is if you're somebody who runs and deals with a lot of pain, or is interested in running, but deals with a lot of Achilles issues or calf pain or knee pain, hip pain, low back pain from running, whatever it may be, try switching to an off-road environment. You might find that the off-road environment is actually much less stressful on your system, simply even to walk on, versus a concrete or asphalt system, because there you have more absorption of force from the ground when you walk over it, but also because of the unstable surface, your body has to pump and mobilize itself while you're moving in order to adapt. And this can actually create more movement in joints, more movement in the body itself, and can actually be quite beneficial and strengthen the body in ways that needs to be strengthened. For example, if you have somebody who is a weightlifter and they are using a Smith machine, or they're using some sort of machine that has a single axis that the weight comes down on, there's no stabilization factor in there. The weight is already being stabilized by the fact that it's locked into a machine. So there's really only one range of motion that you need to utilize in order to move the weight. You don't have to worry about adapting to different movements. You don't have to worry about the uncertainty of where the weight is going to go. So you can get very strong, but in one plane of motions. And as soon as that weight goes outside, then you have to stabilize, and people can get very injured, especially if they're used to this single range of motion movement and only having the stabilization in one plane. When you have when you have somebody who lifts weights and it's a free weight, now you have to stabilize the weight, and the weight can go back, the weight can go forward, it can go to the side, it can twist and rotate, and you have to stabilize more in that environment with that free weight, because there's more susceptibility to change. So your body adapts to change and stabilizes and compensates for the change, and that creates a stronger joint and more ranges of motion versus a single range of motion. So if you're running on asphalt, your body doesn't have to stabilize for those different ranges of motion. It's very predictable. Concrete is much like the Smith machine of running. Um, it's very simple. You don't have to go outside of there. It's a very narrow, broad bandwidth of communication with the foot up through the connect chain. So if you're running on an off-road environment, now your body needs to be able to compensate, much like the weightlifter has to compensate for the fact that the weight can move anywhere and rotate and twist, and it creates dynamic strength that can be strong while it's moving versus simply staying in one box and being strong in one box. But as soon as you get outside of that box, things break down, and they usually break down pretty quickly. So a lot of people get injured. So why this is all important, to go back to my original point, is in an off-road environment, you have to dynamically stabilize the system, and this creates strength in ranges of motion that simply aren't there many times in an asphalt environment. So if you're a runner or somebody who's interested in running and you're dealing with issues, or you are maybe hesitant because you don't want to get injured, try running on natural trails, so like dirt trails, off-road trails. There's plenty of places in most cities where there are popular hikes that people can go running on. Find an off-road trail to run on. Another thing you can do is, if there's great running trails that are concrete, but there's a dirt path next to them, next time you run on that, choose the dirt path, because you're going to get less force being redistributed back through your system. So that's just a quick tip today on running and movement in general on very strong, sturdy, man-made environments versus more natural environments, and how that can relate to the biomechanics of your body, and how that relates to imbalances and musculoskeletal problems. So I hope that was helpful. Please leave a comment or connect with me if you have any questions. I'd be happy to connect with you and share my love with you. So have a good